At WWDC 2020, Apple announced the transition to Apple Silicon. What does that mean for upgrading your systems in the future? Let's have a chat.
This is Living on iPad with David Eden Sangwell.
My name is David for Living on iPad, and I simplify Apple so that everything just works for you. If you want the latest Apple news, rumours and leaks every day at 12 UTC, like this video, subscribe and ring the bell so that you don't miss a thing. So just around the corner are Apple's first, at least for consumers, Apple Silicon powered Macs. Over the past few years, Apple's computers, with the notable exception of the Mac Pro, have been becoming less and less upgradable as the years have gone by. Now, we should probably expect that to continue with Apple Silicon, because we're essentially combining the iPad and the iPhone with the Macs that we've come to know. But that might not be a bad thing. So, before we get right into this, some ground rules. If you dislike the idea of unupgradable Macs, the thumbs down button is not the one for you. The thumbs down button is if you hate my videos. So if you dislike the idea, but you like the way that I presented this video, thumbs up it is. If you hate my face, go for it. But just bear in mind that those like and dislike buttons are for my video and not for Apple's ideas. So we'll start off with a little bit of Apple history. When Apple was first founded, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and there was another guy, but he got paid off for like $800 and then regretted it a lot, because that would have been worth a lot of money right now. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had really different ideas about what a computer should be. Wozniak is a full-on geek, loved tinkering, loved pulling things apart, and wanted to make a kit computer that people could tinker with and expand as much as they wanted. Steve Jobs wanted something that worked and was easy for people to use. And it looks like Steve Jobs has won out over the long term. Whenever you hear Apple talk about their systems, they never really talk in terms of specs. They never talk about resolutions on screens. They talk about retina, the fact that each pixel is too small for your eye to see. They don't talk about 1080p or 4K in most cases. When they're talking about video modes and filming, then they do, because that's important then. When they're talking about the resolution of an iPhone, it doesn't matter. What they need to tell you about is the experience that it gives you, not how many pixels it has. So Apple always talks about abilities and capability rather than specification and numbers. So going right back to when Steve Jobs came back to Apple after he was fired and went off to do all of his stuff with Pixar and Next Computer, he came back to Apple because Apple needed the Next software that he was developing, which is what became the basis of OS X, and the computers that were coming out at that time were actually pretty upgradable. They weren't simple to dismantle in a lot of cases, like the iMacs, but when you look at the PowerMacs, they actually gave you the whole side panel on the PowerMac G3s would fold down, and the main board, the logic board, was attached to that, so that it was super easy to work on and super easy to upgrade. With those, you could pretty much change everything apart from probably the processor, although I think even those were replaceable. They just weren't widely available to do. Even when you get up to the PowerMac G5, it had a beautiful panel on the side that you lifted a latch at the back. It came away. You could see everything. The hard drives were in these special sleds, so you could just slide them straight in and out. It was super nice. So they were like cableless hard drive bays, and I think there was 4 across the top. That continued into the Mac Pro that used the same chassis as the PowerMac G5. That was the original cheese grater before they went to the weird trash can thing that was kind of pointless. And then we've gone back to a new cheese grater now, and that is still the most upgradable Mac you can get. Even the PowerMac G4 Cube, which was kind of magical because it was so small at the time and silent with no fans, had a pop-out handle in the base that you popped in, it pulled out, and then you could remove the entire guts of the computer to access and to upgrade RAM and hard drives and things like that. Then we get to the Ipod Generation, and this is when Steve was really, by the way, from here on out, when I say Steve, I mean Jobs. Then we get to the Ipod Generation, which is when Steve was really starting to focus on things being tight, really well designed, really beautiful industrial design. And there is a famous story about Steve Jobs from this time period where engineers brought him an engineering sample of the iPod, which he said we need it to be smaller. Famously, when Steve introduced the iPod, he said 1,000 songs in your pocket, and he described it as being about the size of a deck of cards. Now, the engineers brought him this sample and said they couldn't make it any smaller, and he took it and dropped it into a fish tank. And as he pointed at the bubbles that were coming out of it, he went, "There is empty space inside, you can make it smaller." So So obviously they had to go back and try and make it even smaller. It's pretty mean, but it made the point pretty well. And so since that point, over the years, they have become more and more tightly integrated. We went from quite easy to replace batteries in the early iPhones, where you just took off the back panel, to having to access everything through the front, having to lift up the display, which was a little bit dangerous. And then you got to the point where home buttons were integrated into the glass with Touch ID in there, which had to be paired with the security chips and the secure enclaves, and they became less repairable, but certainly not upgradable by any means. However, with Macs, we have had the iMacs. The iMac 27-inch has still got that hatch at the back where you can upgrade the RAM yourself very simply, which is great. It's only on the 27-inch. The 21-inch, you don't get that. And with all of the iMacs at this point, you have to actually cut the screen off of these things to access anything other than that RAM. So if you wanted to do a processor upgrade or a processor replacement, they are socketed, but they are difficult to get to, and you have to kind of dismantle the whole machine to get to it. By the same token, you cannot replace in almost any Mac now, including now the 27-inch iMacs, you can't replace the storage, because there is a T2 chip which is paired to the storage, which helps to encrypt it on the fly, and the T2 chip adds a whole bunch of other stuff. It is basically an ARM Apple Silicon processor that's already in many of the Macs that we have now. Although it adds a lot of power and it adds a lot of capability to the Macs and it adds security, it does also take away some of the customizability of these Macs. The Mac Pro, as I mentioned earlier, is still the gold standard of upgradability for Apple. The entire case lifts off, so you can get to every internal component. You can add your own RAM, up to 1.5 terabytes of RAM, which is just an insane amount. You can upgrade the processor up to 28 cores currently. You can add afterburner cards, you can add whatever you want. And I think that might hint towards what we might see with some of the Apple Silicon Macs. We have to take a look at who actually buys Apple computers right now. So as much as people watching this channel are probably tech enthusiasts, the vast majority of people that are using a Mac are probably not. Apple is one of the very few computer producers and technology producers in general where the devices themselves are almost a fashion accessory. That includes Macs, that includes iPhones, iPads, Apple Watch. For God's sake, they were doing a $10,000 Apple Watch with a gold coating, and that was the Series 0, which is terrible. That doesn't mean that these people don't want to have a good computer. It doesn't mean that they don't want to have all the power that they need. They want to have something that is fast, that is reliable, and that just works. That's the beauty of it. And it's that just works that is what Apple is doing so well, and partially that is due to the fact that they don't let you change much. The reason that everything with Apple just works is that they know exactly what hardware is inside. This is why we don't have all the problems that Windows has with multiple drivers, with hardware incompatibility, with all of the stuff that can happen with a Windows computer. It's not Windows' fault. There's no fault involved at all, but it's that Windows is having to deal with any bit of equipment that is produced by anyone, and then they can write their own drivers, which hopefully will work and won't conflict with anything else. It's a very, very difficult balance to strike. Whereas Apple is trying to make their computers and their devices, their iPads, their iPhones, into consumer devices which just work out the box, and when they stop working, you recycle them. Apple devices work for far longer than most Windows devices do. Yes, if you get a desktop tower, you can pull bits out when they stop working, you can replace them with something else. But the case is not where all of the e-waste is coming from. The e-waste is coming from the bits that you keep having to replace. And Apple has made it very clear in the past year at least, but going back far longer, that they are committed to environmentalism. So a big part of that is the fact that these computers work, and once they're finished with, Apple has ways to recycle them. But they work for far, far longer than a Windows computer. So I have a MacBook Air around here, which is a 2011. That still works. It has had to have a new battery into it, because batteries do just have a shelf life. There's not a lot you can do about that. It's had a new battery, and that's it. That's it. It was a £900 computer when I bought it. It's gone for 9 years. £100 a year for a computer that's as snappy as that, and it is still snappy. It still looks modern when you pull it out of your bag. Yes, it's got big bezels. Yes, it's got big bits of aluminium around the outside of the display, but it still looks nice. It still looks modern. It's still thinner than almost any Windows computer that you can buy for a reasonable amount of money. And it's all SSD, it's only got 4 gigs of RAM, and you can't upgrade that, but it still works. And this is the difference with Apple computers. They work for years, they get good software support for years. That thing, I think, got 7 years of the latest version of Mac OS, and I've managed to now force Catalina onto it using the stuff from DOS Dude, which is really cool. And it still works. It will not run Big Sur, I don't think, but we'll probably give it a try just for giggles. But this is the thing, because once something stops working for normal consumers, tinkerers can then get involved. That's great fun. However, with Apple Silicon, we are expecting to get system on a chips exactly the same as we get in the iPad. So you're going to get your processor, your RAM, probably your storage, your T2 chip, and all of the other stuff that goes around it, because these are not going to be a computer like you know. Looking at the specs, looking at the processor speed and the amount of RAM will not tell you the story in the way that with a Windows computer, which is essentially all that Macs are right now, is a bunch of off-the-shelf components in most cases attached to a custom logic board. With these, they're going to be completely built from scratch to run Mac OS as well as it possibly can. So you're going to have the image signal processors that we have in iOS. We're going to have the neural engine for machine learning. We're going to have so much more tacked on. We'll have hardware video decoders that are purposely built around what Apple uses in their software. Everything will be perfectly tuned to work together in the same way that Final Cut Pro works so insanely well on a Mac compared to running Adobe Premiere, which is a great piece of software, but because Apple creates Final Cut Pro, they use exactly the right codecs and exactly the right stuff to make it absolutely scream on a Mac, even when it shouldn't really have the power that you would expect, and Adobe Premiere would really struggle to run at all. So that's the beauty of what Apple is going to be creating. It's going to be creating this perfect synergy of hardware and software that just works together, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. The fact you're also going to be able to run all of those iPhone and iPad apps that you've already bought from the iOS store on your Mac, on your desktop, is going to be insanely good. If I can run LumaFusion for a lot of the editing that I do, I could probably do most of it in that. I love Final Cut as well, but I can't wait to see how that runs as well on Apple Silicon. I know we've seen it already a little bit on the developer transition kit at WWDC, but seeing it on the actual custom silicon that's been made specifically for Macs is going to be mind-blowing. So when we look down the actual list of Macs that we have, starting off with the notebooks, I think the notebooks are very much going to be an iPad with a built-in keyboard and trackpad in terms of the hardware. So it's probably going to be something very similar to the A14X chip in the first Apple Silicon Macs. This is what the rumours have been going into that MacBook 12-inch chassis. So you are pretty much going to have a single board, a big old battery compared to an iPad, a hardware keyboard, an attached display separate to it, and that's pretty much going to be what you get. But it will run Mac OS. You will probably have the options for storage at the time of purchase, and you will not have an opportunity to change that once you've bought it. So it's going to be important to either get enough storage in the first place or have a contingency where you can have enough storage for yourself out and about on the notebook, and then when you come home, maybe dock it to a display that you can use as your main desktop computer. And then when you dock it to your display, that's also adding additional storage. If you want to do some video editing or something like that, you have an external drive that holds all of your scratch files. When we're moving up to something like the iMac, I think the iMac is potentially going to have some expandability, but I would be very surprised still. I think everything is going to be built into the system on a chip. I think people are going to be surprised at the low amount of RAM that gets mentioned potentially, even if they even mention how much RAM is built into these things. I don't think you're necessarily going to buy it and have a this much, or this much RAM tiers. I think you might have 2 processor options possibly. So you might have a MacBook Pro 13-inch or 14-inch, which comes with the entry-level SoC or the X-level SoC, and then the same when you go to a 16-inch. I don't think they will have different power options for a 13-inch versus a 16-inch. I think you will still get the option of entry-level or X upgraded version. And then when we get to the iMacs, that is going to be the more powerful chips because they haven't got to worry as much about battery drain, so they're going to be able to have a bit more thermal headroom. They're going to have a little bit more ability to pull a bit more power, so that will be interesting. I think the Mac Minis will be identical in basically every way to the iMacs, except without the display attached. So in terms of the architecture, in terms of the ports, in terms of all of that sort of stuff, that will be your difference. Will be, do you want a Mac Mini or do you want it with the display built in? That will be your options. When we come to the Mac Pro, that's the one where I think it's going to be a little bit different. Also, if you want to get more powerful iMacs, I feel like you might be able to just go and we'll add a Mac Mini to it. So you have your iMac and then you add Thunderbolt 4 cable that attaches it to a Mac Mini, which it can use as a slave. I think that would be the way that you give it a real performance boost, is by adding it an extra Apple Silicon processor that it can harness extra RAM in there as well. Maybe that's what we do. The modular Macs become add another Mac to it. Or maybe you can use the extra power that's available on your local area network. So for example, if you're doing a heavy video editing task and you've got an iMac that you're doing that on, but in another room you've got like a media PC that is a Mac Mini, for example, maybe over the network it could share some of the tasks. That would be a really smart way for Apple to do it and integrate it as well with its home kit. Maybe even an Apple TV box, which also has an A series Apple Silicon processor, could give some of its processing power to another system when it's not needed. I'd love to see if Apple can do this and really kind of distribute computing across a network. I think that would be a really interesting, really exciting thing that Apple could do, and it would really encourage households to use even more Macs rather than using a Windows PC here and a Mac over here, and you know, get everyone into that ecosystem and really hold on to them. They cannot get away. We want all of our people on elastic so they can't leave. And the Mac Pro, this is the difficult one because obviously the people have invested huge amounts into their Mac Pros. I'm wondering if Apple is going to release a card that upgrades a Mac Pro and kind of becomes the new core. So like an Afterburner card, or they might even reveal that the Afterburner card runs on Apple Silicon inside and automatically they can run Apple Silicon apps natively using that. That would be a real game changer if they did that. But I don't think that's what they'll do. But if they do, just point everyone at this video and say, yeah, he told us. But I think that would be a really cool way, is basically to get an Apple Silicon card that you add to an existing Mac Pro, and then the Apple Silicon becomes your new heart of the computer and is able to send instructions to the existing x86 cores to kind of take some of the heavy lifting and just do some of the mathematics for it. That would be an interesting way of doing it. I'm not a computer scientist, that is probably impossible, but it would be really cool if they can. I guess what I'm saying is, don't expect a great deal of upgradability. One thing that I do think Apple should do, and I'm not sure if they will, but I think it would be awesome if they do, and again kind of tie in with their environmentals, is people like myself that have got an iMac, or especially the guys that have got the 5K iMacs, because this was one of the last 2560 by 1440 ones. People that have got those 5K iMacs already have got beautiful displays sitting on their desks. And I think if they were able to offer a Mac Mini that can plug into them and use that as the display, and that becomes just a really compelling way for people to upgrade without having to completely throw out what they've got on their desk, which works perfectly well and has got a great display on it. I think that would be such a good move for Apple if they can create a Mac Mini that basically just replaces the internals. And speaking of replacing internals, if we're going to have these beautiful displays on the new iMacs that come out and things like that, let us literally take our iMacs back to Apple if we want to down the line, to replace the whole logic board, because the display isn't going to change that much over the time, and it's certainly not going to become incompatible with Apple Silicon. So let us bring our whole iMac back to you and have an easy way for Apple to replace the entire logic board, so you can essentially get up to the latest SoC, the latest expanded storage, more RAM, all of the above, all of the latest technology that Apple is offering in Apple Silicon, but just replace that whole heart of the computer. Keep your display, keep your speakers, because they're probably going to be fine, your microphones, your Wi-Fi, all of that can stay, just replace that heart of the processing. That, I think, would be really compelling, and it would keep a lot of displays and beautiful computers like this out of landfill. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know people aren't going to be a fan of not being able to upgrade, but I think we need to think about computers in a different way. Think of it more like an iPad, more like an iPhone, but not in a way that you have to replace it so often, but maybe we can upgrade the whole thing in one go. I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, then please like, subscribe, comment down below, and ring that notification bell if you want to see more like this, because I would love to share it with you. Thanks so much for watching.